Hungary just had the most watched election in Europe in years, and it didn't go the way right-wing politicians in Europe were hoping. Populist Viktor Orbán ran Hungary for 16 consecutive years, but he just lost in a landslide. He rewrote the courts, media landscape, electoral maps, and the constitution itself, and became the guy every right-wing populist on the continent, and even here in the US, pointed to when they wanted to know what long-term winning actually looks like. But almost 2 months ago, Peter Magyar's TISA party took a two-thirds supermajority in the Hungarian parliament. So, if the master plan works until it doesn't, what does this tell us about where right-wing politics in Europe actually stand right now? Welcome to Transatlantic Brief. Let's get right into it. The biggest story in European politics for the last decade or so has been, brace yourselves, the right is coming. Brexit, the rise of AfD in Germany, and populist anti-immigration parties gaining ground in local, national, and even in European parliamentary elections. And center-left and centrist governments are falling, so it's not wrong, but it's not telling the whole story. Because over the past several months, right-wing parties have thrown everything they can in major European elections and mostly hit a wall. Hungary is just the most dramatic case because they went from a hard-right Trump-like politician to a more center-right, at least by comparison, Mitt Romney, or for any British viewers, a shift from Nigel Farage to John Major. It was a pretty big correction back to the center, even though Hungary is in a progressive wonderland today. And France and Denmark also had elections that showed similar results. Because when you have multi-party democracy, that is more than two parties, the ceiling that these right-wing parties can realistically achieve is much lower than it takes to actually get into national office. And here's what the results in Hungary actually tell us about right-wing politics in Europe. Peter Magyar was a Fidesz insider, that's Orbán's party, and his ex-wife had been a cabinet minister, but he had no electoral history. What he did and does have is credibility on corruption that no outside opposition figure could touch because he was describing a system he personally watched operate from the inside, at least before his marriage fell apart. Magyar's TISA party went from nothing to a two-thirds parliamentary supermajority in about 2 years. And that's a big deal because in Hungary, a supermajority means you can amend the constitution. And that's the only tool capable of dismantling the institutional architecture Orbán spent years building to keep himself in power permanently, using his own supermajority. And the European right is just trying to figure out what has happened. Because the model held as long as the economy held. But when it stopped delivering, there wasn't enough left to rig. Orbán's approach has an actual name in political science. It's called competitive authoritarianism. You keep the formal democratic institutions. You just bend them to your will. The media, district boundaries, state resources, courts, until the playing field is barely recognizable. And you do it slowly enough that no single move triggers a constitutional crisis. Think of it like boiling a frog. You don't do it all at once. You slowly raise the temperature so the frog doesn't notice until it winds up in a dictatorship, and then it's too late. The EU repeatedly sanctioned Hungary over this democratic backsliding. It never really hurt Orbán, and if anything, it gave him a villain to run against. But the EU couldn't give him a functioning economy. That was still his responsibility. Hungary's GDP contracted in 2023 and grew at roughly 0.5% through 2024 and 2025. Well below the EU average, which was 0.4 to 1.5% growth over the same period. More bad news for Orbán, and Hungarians I guess, was that inflation peaked at 17% in 2023, the highest in Central and Eastern Europe. Public services then began to fall apart, and Hungarians who had accepted this institutional trade-off because the economy was delivering found out that the economy had stopped. Those economic headwinds plus Magyar's first-hand accounts of corruption was a perfect storm that even Orbán's rigged system couldn't overcome. Over in France, the very right-wing National Rally Party more than tripled its elected officials in mayoral and council positions in France's municipal elections last March. And if you're looking at raw numbers, that sounds pretty impressive. But there are still some big warning signs if you're rooting for a right-wing renaissance in next year's presidential elections. City by city, the anti-right-wing vote consolidated behind whoever had the best shot at beating them in the runoff. And they did break through and win in some cities, like in Nice. But for the most part, the cordon sanitaire, the unwritten rule since World War II that mainstream parties don't hand the far right a win, held again. And there's another huge variable in next year's presidential election. Marine Le Pen, National Rally's 2017 and 2022 candidate, will face an appeals court ruling on July 7th on her conviction of misusing EU funds, which carries a 5-year ban from public office. If she loses it and can't run again in 2027, the 30-year-old Jordan Bardella is the likely candidate. And the coalition that's beaten the Le Pen family 3 times now is going to have to do it again for a 4th time against a candidate with a higher favorability rating than his mentors ever had. But I wouldn't be surprised if the French center and left hold their noses again and rally behind the anyone but them banner again next year. Denmark had snap elections in March, called early because of the Greenland crisis with the United States, which produced a hung parliament that neither side could really call a win. The far-right immigration skeptic parties combined to around 15% of the vote. But that's about the same result this faction of Danish politics have gotten for a few decades. There weren't new right-wing voters, they just kind of rearranged into different parties. And this is the main reason why all these European right-wing parties are hitting a wall. The template they borrowed, one dominant leader, one defining issue, winner take all, was built for a 2-party system, mainly the United States. You get to 51%, you run the government, you push through your agenda, that's it. But Europe mostly doesn't work this way. Proportional representation means 30% of the vote gets you 30% of the seats, a spot in a coalition, and a whole lot of leverage, but not the keys to the castle. You can't expect to govern with partners if you spend your entire campaign calling them existential threats to your very way of life. To actually govern, you need partners. And the mainstream parties across Europe have spent 80 years developing an informal rule about not handing those keys to the far right because they still remember what happens when you do. Orbán is the one leader who actually cracked it. And the way he did it wasn't by winning a bigger coalition, it was by spending 16 years rewriting the rules from the inside once he got there. The courts, the maps, the media, this all sounds familiar, until the system itself worked for him. And that's what Magyar is now inheriting the tools to dismantle, and he's already doing it. The lesson for every right-wing party on the continent is that the ceiling is real, it's strong, and the one guy who figured out how to break through just lost. So that's the European right as it stands today. There is still real movement towards them, largely fueled by anti-immigration, but there are limits to what they can accomplish on their own, and the most successful right-wing populist in Europe just went down in flames, thanks largely to a sputtering Hungarian economy and the perfect candidate running against him. Barring any other snap election, the next big test will be next year's presidential election in France, and whether they'll elect the first far-right head of government in a major Western European democracy since World War II, or whether that anyone but them coalition holds for the 4th time. Subscribe, and I'll be sure to tell you about it when it happens. See you next week.